Okay guys, so welcome to chapter on histology. Essentially we're going to be talking about microscopic anatomy. The primary way we categorize cells when we look at them under a microscope is to separate all cells in the body into 4 tissue types. This is based on the idea that in every single organ in the body there are cells that are doing similar function, and as long as those cells can be grouped together into sort of one cohesive unit, those cells doing the same function, in histology we call these tissues. So every single organ consists of multiple tissue types, meaning a collection of similar cells that are doing the same function. The 4 tissue types that are important in histology are the epithelial tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, and muscle. The connective tissue and muscle tissues we're going to talk about in a separate lecture. Today we're only going to talk about epithelial tissue, different examples, where they're found, what they're doing in the body, and a little bit about the nervous tissue, which obviously starts the topic of the nervous system, which will be discussed next semester. Now, for the epithelial tissue, these are essentially cells of different shapes, different varieties. They are lining and coverings of organs. So imagine any kind of organ. On top of that organ, inside, internal linings, on the outside, external surfaces, they will have most likely some kind of epithelial tissue there. So essentially, epithelial tissues are coverings and linings of organs. They're used for absorption, they're used to protect the organ, they're used for communication, things like that, with different other cells. Now, primarily, epithelial tissues will be one of the most commonly encountered cells you'll see under a microscope. And we're going to go over how visually we describe epithelial cells and what is the best way to sort of recognize them under a microscope. Now, first thing to do is to realize that epithelial cells come in essentially sheets of cells that could be 1 layer thick or multiple layers. If you see 1 layer of cells, they're epithelial cells, we call this simple epithelium. So 1 layer of cells, like for instance here, these square-like cells is 1 layer, so we call this simple epithelium. If you have more than 1 layer of epithelial cells, we call this stratified, from the word strata, which means layers. So more than 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers, sometimes even more, we call that stratified epithelium. If now we have what looks like somewhat more complex structure, where we have what looks like multiple layers, but in reality, every single layer, actually, every single cell somehow manages to squeeze between and touch down to the bottom of the basal lamina component here, that the support tissue that we're going to talk about soon. Then this type of epithelium is called pseudostratified or false stratified. Again, there's not that many examples in the body of that, other than in very specific areas that I'm going to mention later when we go over the examples. But essentially, when we have 1 layer, we have simple epithelium, more than 1 layer stratified, and then what looks like more than 1 layer but technically is 1 is pseudostratified. Now, before we get into talking about these different shapes of cells that we see in epithelium, keep in mind that epithelium, because of the amount of cells present there, epithelium is essentially avascular, which means it has no blood vessels within the epithelium, and the nearest blood vessels must allow diffusion of oxygen and nutrients to go through the support tissue to reach the actual epithelial cells. So when we look at a typical structure of epithelial cells, this is a kind of a general schematic, not exactly something you're going to be seeing directly under a microscope like that, but generally just to illustrate that point. When we have the epithelium cells, right, they're all kind of arranged in this order like that. This is simple epithelium. Underneath the epithelium, whatever you see there, will be what's called the extracellular matrix. And this is the collection of things called the ground substance and basically different kinds of connective tissue materials, different proteins, different fibers like collagen fibers, other kinds of fibers, and all kinds of other material that supports and provides essentially nutritional and physical support to the epithelial cells. Okay, so whenever you see support structure, which is essential to epithelial cells, that structure is located underneath it. We call that usually either just basement membrane or basal lamina. And generally, right, this is the extracellular matrix, right? Matrix is just a collection of different kinds of fibers and support structure. This is actually found in connective tissue as well, and just in the epithelial tissues, we kind of start talking about this, and you'll see how it comes into play when we talk about the connective tissue in the next lecture. So all epithelial tissues, again, are avascular. They must have that extracellular matrix, that basement membrane underneath them to provide support. Another important component is that every single cell that is epithelial cell must have connections between them, things that are like tight junctions and gap junctions and desmosomes and others. They are connecting each individual epithelial cells together and making sure that they have proper appearance like that, as long as the physiology is normal and the cells are healthy. And this is in a similar way when we thought about how every cell must have a nucleus, and if a cell does not have a nucleus, usually this is a dying cell or cell has died. So every single epithelial cell must have that proper appearance, must have these protein connections between them. They're tightly binding the cells together and allowing for communication between the epithelial cells. Now let's talk about how else we're going to categorize these cells. We're going to look at them based on their appearance. So, for instance, squamous cells, a very common type of epithelial cell, is a flat type of cell. So we'll have a general appearance like this. Right? Flat cell means squamous. So if you have, for instance, looking at your skin under a microscope, you see that you have a lot of flat cells there, a lot of squamous cells. That's the kind of cells we commonly encounter. Every single epithelial tissue has a particular level of organization and appearance based on the function of that organ, right? So the reason epithelial cells in the skin are squamous is because squamous cells are the best kind of cells to have in areas of trauma or abrasion, where you often will be kind of having impact on that area, and you want the cells to be very tough or be able to come off easily and be replaced by new cells, and not be very delicate and very kind of weak, because this would not be consistent with the function of the organ. Right? So everything has to make sense here. Structure, remember, dictates the function of the organ. Another type of cell, if we see a kind of a square-like cell, remember that square in 3 dimensions is a cube, so this would be a cuboidal type of cell. Right? Again, another very common type of cell, cuboidal, square-like cells, kind of like cells here. This would be the general appearance under a microscope, although sometimes those cells might be a little bit more rounded. But again, ideally, you can imagine what this cell looks like. Cuboidal, it's kind of a square-like appearance. And then if a cell is taller than it is wide, with a nucleus that is generally towards the bottom, towards the basement membrane, we're going to have a column-like cell, so it's a columnar type of epithelium cell. Okay, so these are the 3 main cell types: squamous, flat, cuboidal, square-like, and columnar tall cells. Now, in order to give us a better idea of what kind of specific organs will have different varieties of these epithelial cells, let's go into an actual example. So first example is simple squamous epithelium. Again, this is one layer of cells, all flat cells. Where would you see this? 2 main locations. You're going to see these in capillaries. These are the smallest types of blood vessels, where diffusion of gases is essential, like diffusion of oxygen and things like that. And another example is the air sacs or alveoli in our lungs for the respiratory function. In order for gas exchange to occur, again, the alveoli are made out of simple squamous epithelium. These flat, thin cells allow easy diffusion of gases into hemoglobin, so that our red blood cells can pick up the oxygen from the air, right, and carry that oxygen to all the cells in the body. So simple squamous epithelium, 2 examples: capillaries and alveoli in the lungs. Another example now, another tissue. Let's say simple cuboidal epithelium. Now we have basically square-like cells, 1 layer thing. What is a good example of this epithelium in the body? This would be the kidneys. The kidneys are organs that filter out the blood, right? Making sure to remove all kinds of metabolic waste from the blood. And in order to do that, the structures inside the kidney under a microscope are these tubules or pipe-like structures, sort of like plumbing, that go through the entire kidney and allowing the filtrate to pass through and removing all kinds of waste. If you cut cross-section of these tubules, you would see that they are actually simple cuboidal epithelium histologically, right? And that is basically kind of going to look like this. So you have the structure and you have these kind of cells like that. Each of these cells here are obviously one layer thick, and these are the cuboidal cells. Again, the appearance will vary differently depending how you're looking at that slide and sort of those images. But overall, right, that's the proper distinction here between other collections of cells. So simple cuboidal epithelium, well, you will find this in the kidneys, in the tubules. And then the last example here is simple columnar epithelium, and these are one layer of tall cells. Best example where you're going to find this would be in the gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract, or the digestive system. Anywhere in the digestive system where actual absorption of nutrients takes place, we have molecules like that, basically. So essentially, simple columnar epithelium will be one layer of tall cells located anywhere where absorption of nutrients takes place in the digestive system. So we're thinking of like the stomach, small intestines, those areas where molecules will be broken down and then absorbed. Okay, now let's go over to stratified now. So for stratified, we're going to take a look at only squamous cells, because the other ones, they do exist, but they're sort of a little bit less important for us. And so two main examples for stratified squamous epithelium would be in the skin, right? So skin, the top layer is epidermis. That layer consists of stratified squamous epithelium, multiple layers of flat cells. And because there's also keratin on top of that, we call this keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So what is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium? This is a collection of cells with that protective protein keratin at the top layer of our skin, which is the epidermis. Okay, so epidermis is just one word for that area. Histologic description is stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. And then those surfaces in the body, which we call mucosal surfaces, like inside your mouth, for instance, inside the oral cavity, it basically has the same types of cells except does not have keratin. So we call that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, right? So the mucosal surface is like inside the mouth, inside the oral cavity. Don't need keratin because there is no sun exposure, obviously, in those areas. And you sort of don't need that extra level of protection that the keratin protein provides, but you still do need those stratified squamous cells. When we talk about the skin, we'll go into more details about this area. Now, and then another example here is pseudostratified epithelium. For this type of epithelium, we have to think about also something called cilia, which are the hair-like projections which move at the top surface of the epithelial cells. So if we take pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, we have another example here, and this is the type of epithelium found in the respiratory system, especially in the trachea and the airway passageways where the air is going through on its way to the alveoli of the lungs where gas exchange occurs. Right? We already know that alveoli basically consist of simple squamous epithelium, but all the rest of the structures there where the air is not actually going to be exchanged, but will just be passing through on their way to the alveoli, those respiratory passageways consist of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. What does that mean? What this means is that basically cilia are there to allow the mucus that has been trapped together with the debris, all kinds of particles, to be moved away from those organs so that we don't actually get those damaging particles to our alveoli, to the delicate cells, and clear out this mucociliary action, clear out all kinds of debris that we don't need, right? To essentially get rid of it, Mucus is sticky, right? These are lipid-based molecules that trap all kinds of pollution, all kinds of particles. And the cilia keep moving constantly, allowing that mucus to be flushed out of the system. Okay, and the last type of epithelium I want to mention is something called transitional epithelium. And this is the one that basically we're not going to be talking about it, whether it's simple or stratified, any of these things. This is a collection of very specific types of cells. They are technically stratified. There are multiple layers of these cells, but they have different appearances, right? Transitional meaning change, right? So when you think of the urinary system, like the urinary bladder or the ureters, where the urine will be passing through before it can be expelled out of the body, if urine is present in that area and it's compressing the organ, like for instance the walls of the bladder, right, with the volume of the urine, then those cells would be flattened out, and so the transitional epithelium will have these kind of flat, like almost squamous-like cells. And imagine if the bladder is relaxed, it's empty, the urine has been already removed, right, expelled, then those cells can bounce back and become nice, bigger, plumper cells, kind of more like cuboidal cells probably in appearance. And again, the only type of epithelium that can do this is the transitional epithelium, again found in the urinary bladder, in the urinary tract. Again, two states, either flattened cells because of the compression of urine, or no urine, the cells bounce back, sort of get nice and big again, round in appearance. You will see this under microscope, kind of very unique appearance when you see it on the slides, and kind of remember where we are for this area. Okay. Now, for the next tissue type, the nervous tissue, essentially here what we're talking about is what is the function of the nervous tissue? The function of the nervous tissue is communication, sending electrochemical messages via neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, and others. These small molecule messages across long distances to allow communication between different organs in the body, allowing the brain to tell other organs what to do through different nerves. So every single nerve or neuron is the main cell type part of the nervous tissue. Now, a neuron looks very different from a regular cell, right? This is the general kind of a picture of a typical neuron. We have the cell body of all the organelles, and obviously the nucleus is in the middle there. That's where everything happens, right? That's where all the structures are, all the components. Extensions out of the cell body are called dendrites. These are like branches of a tree. And then one longest extension is called an axon, ending at an axon terminal that actually will be sending the message, releasing those chemical messages, electrochemical messages to other cells. So the way the communication goes essentially starts here in the cell body, goes through the axon, winds up here, and then this axon can now talk to the dendrite of the next neuron. So the axon always sends the signal, and another neuron, another cell, if it's dendrites, will be receiving that signal. If the other cell is not a neuron, let's say it's like a muscle cell, then obviously just the signal is sent to that muscle cell, for instance. Again, we're going to talk a lot more about this when we go into the nervous system in more detail later in the book and the next semester, essentially. Okay, so now what kind of basic things we can talk about when we're looking at the nervous tissue? So essentially here, what we're talking about are, again, primary cells. These are the neurons, and then all the support cells that must help the neurons do their function, provide nutritional, physical, and other kind of support, and these are the glial cells or neuroglial cells. Glia means glue, right? Sort of like keeps everything together in the nervous system. There are many different types of support cells. We'll talk about them in detail again when we talk about the nervous tissue. For now, just keep in mind that the main cell types are the neurons. Who supports the neurons? Who provides the physical, nutritional, and other kind of support? These are the glial cells. And very briefly, in terms of the divisions of the nervous tissue, we have essentially the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, right, that extends out from the brain. So inside the cranial cavity, we have the brain, and then the spinal cord extends out. Those two areas, specifically, primarily the brain, obviously, is responsible for the control and the governing of all the functions in the body. And then the spinal cord is there to kind of allow spinal nerves to exit out for the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system consists of many different types of nerves going to every single organ in the body. And those nerves can be also subdivided into different areas like motor neurons or sensory neurons and others, and essentially dealing whether with control of muscular function like a motor neuron, or sensory function such as a sense of touch or feeling temperature, pain, things like that. And another way to distinguish this, to kind of separate, is that to say that there is some kind of somatic functions in the body and some autonomic functions. Somatic is those that you control, autonomic those that are involuntary. Further subdivision of this is that specifically, for instance, in the digestive tract, we have something called the enteric nervous system, and these are collections of nerves specifically dealing with the digestive function, eventually obviously controlled by the brain, but also have subspecialized control level at the level of the digestive system, where these very specific neurotransmitters and specific nerves control the functions of the liver, the stomach, pancreas, and all the other organs of digestion. Again, for this topic, make sure to look at the images for histology for the epithelial tissue, for the nervous tissue, to distinguish the different examples and varieties of these tissue types, and to review this information in the book.